Excellent. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Angela. I work in Onkaparinga Libraries, but I'm part of the South Australian Library Network. And it's awesome to have you with us. And so firstly, I'd like to, let me get to my page right. I'd like to start by saying that we're chatting from Ghana land here in South Australia. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to thank Laura from Allen and Unwin for giving us this chance to chat today, and also for public libraries as well, because obviously we all put in our case why we wanted to host you, and we were really lucky to win that here in Onkaparinga, so that was really good. If you would like to put any of Chris's books on hold, you can do that. Obviously, you can walk into any public library in South Australia, or probably anywhere in Australia, and put those books on hold. You can phone your local library or do it online. And we've got all the stocks of the books, as you can see behind me. And you can, if you want to own the books too, again, all bookshops probably have your books, but we like to give a special shout out to Dimmicks in Glenelg, because they support us by always having a really good selection and stock of all the authors that we chat to. So thank you to everyone for participating in getting Chris with us today. Now, if you would like to ask questions of Chris, I'm going to ask some questions to start with, and then if you've got questions, you can ask them too by placing your question in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you can't see the Q&A, you just have to move your mouse around, because the bar with Zoom disappears to give you best view of the author. But if you pop your question in there, we'll attempt to ask all the questions at the end. And I think that's all I have to say from that. So welcome, Chris. That's the last thing I have to say.
Thank you so much.
You've been a journalist for 30 years, more probably, and you've reported from over 30 countries. You've held some impressive job titles, such as Chief Political Correspondent for The Bulletin, Senior Writer for The Age and Online Political Editor for The Age and Sydney Morning Herald. So that does sound quite impressive. I'm sure you've had a very impressive life with all your experiences. I suppose my first question is, has that helped you with your writing?
Yeah, it certainly has helped me, although I must say straight off the top, I reckon I'm much happier as a fiction author than I ever was as a journalist. That's not because I was unhappy as a journalist. I absolutely loved it. But this is a very privileged position to be in, to be able to write books for a living. It's just such a joy. Bits of the journalism background that helped me. Probably the main thing is it just demystifies the process of writing. I mean, a lot of aspiring writers, are waiting there for inspiration. But imagine as a journalist ringing up your editor and saying, "Oh, I don't think I'll file a story today. I'm not feeling inspired." You'd be out the door pretty quick if you tried that. And so, I sit down and write pretty much every day. It's not really self-discipline so much as I'm sort of addicted to it. I just really like doing it. It doesn't feel quite right if I haven't done it. Other aspects of journalism, I guess, that help is just a few probably insights in how the world works, a bit of background knowledge, and some idea probably of how to put a story together. There's a lot of journalists who have become writers, and then there's a lot who try and for some reason don't quite make it. But amongst, say, Australian crime writers, Jane Harper was a journalist, Michael Rowbotham was a journalist, the late great Peter Temple was a journalist. So there's a few of us who have made that transition.
Oh, I didn't realise there was so many that had done that. So I've read all of those authors as well. So I know when you first started writing, you wrote 2 non-fiction titles. Was it a hard transition to go from writing that Like, would you consider writing another non-fiction title, and what made you want to write about the specific subjects that you wrote about with those titles?
So I wrote 2 non-fiction books. One was called The River, and it traced my travels through the Murray-Darling Basin at the height of the millennial drought. So this is a summer of, say, 2008, 2009, starting up in Queensland in the headwaters and travelling all the way down to South Australia through the Riverland to the lower lakes there. And then I wrote a second book called The Coast, which was a similar journey down Australia's east coast. They call it narrative nonfiction. So it's not completely fact-based in that you're telling the readers your impressions of things, that there's room to be reflective and whatever in it. So for me as a journalist, it was a terrific bridge into writing fiction. I actually learned, I think, a lot about the rhythms of prose in writing those books that you wouldn't pick up just doing daily journalism. I've said before, I learned 3 things about doing those books. One was that I could actually finish a book, because of course, until you do it, you don't know. The second is that I actually liked writing books, which came as a bit of a surprise. I always liked the idea of being a writer and writing books. It was just the actual process. And the third thing I found was there was no money in it. So I had to go back and get a real job. And that's why I turned my hand to fiction. I was missing the writing, but I couldn't afford to do the research and the travel and whatever. Would I ever go back to doing it? Look, maybe. I've got no plans. I'm too happy doing what I'm doing right now. But I have always had a soft spot for travel writing, I must say.
Okay. Now, I suppose we should ask a question about your book. That's why we're here today, Treasure and Dirt.
Sure.
Now, I know everywhere I look on the internet, it's saying it's a standalone book. But I want to say, obviously, you've got the 2 characters from your other books, Ivan and Morris. And I, because when you're reading, you say words in a certain way. So I was saying Ivan Lucic, but then I looked at one of your other interviews and you were saying Lucic. So I think I've got the mispronunciation. I'm mispronouncing your words. But my question is, with this, is in your other 3 books, Ivan was like a bit of a bit player. He was like a second detective. And Morris was the main lead character. And Morris was very likable. But in this book, you mentioned Morris a lot, but he was absent. And Ivan, in all your other books, I don't know if this was intentional, but I didn't like Ivan in your other books. But I really warmed to him in this book. And so I wanted to know, was that intentional? Because obviously you expanded his character a lot more in this book, and you made readers realize why he was like he was and his history. So was that intentional and why did you decide to use Ivan as the main character in this book?
Okay, there's about 15 questions there.
No, sorry.
Let me just unpack that a bit for the people listening, because some of them I know won't have read any of the books and they're wondering what the hell we're talking about. Okay, the first 3 books I wrote, they're behind Angela, Scrublands, Silver and Trust. The main protagonist is actually a journalist called Martin Scarsden. And then as the books go along, his partner Mandalay or Mandy Blonde also takes a major role. He's a journalist and he gets tied up investigating murders as he's doing his work for the Sydney Morning Herald. But there's a minor character, some who recur, and there's 2 policemen. Maurice Montefiore, that Martin, by the end of the books by Trust, has developed quite a close relationship with. And Maurice Montefiore, though, has an off-sider called Ivan Lucic, and he's a rather surly character, but a very minor one. He's nothing much. In this book, Treasure and Dirt, he becomes one of the two main protagonists. So, and he's joined the other main protagonist, the other point of view character. So you alternate points of view between Ivan and Nell Buchanan. So Ivan is Detective Sergeant Ivan Lukic. He's an experienced homicide detective from Sydney. Nell Buchanan is Detective Constable Nell Buchanan, freshly minted as a detective, not a homicide detective. She's based out in the far west of New South Wales at Bourke, which is, you know, in New South Wales terms, about as remote, as close to remote as you can get, certainly if you're a detective. So what Angela, I think, sort of referring to in part is there are continuing characters, and there are some other continuing characters. Martin Scarsden himself doesn't appear in the book, but he's mentioned in the book, and he's referred to. And the same with Maurice Montefiore, the Ivan's boss, and there's a few other minor characters, like, for example, the rather dim television reporter Doug Funkleton turns up near the end of Treasure and Dirt. So that's, look, that's a kind of potted summary of what's going on and the interaction between the books.
So my last question is, yeah, did you intend people to love him by the time they'd finished this one, or like him more than in the other books?
Yeah, I did. So right from the start with Scrublands, I didn't want to make my characters black and white. I didn't want the goodies to be all, you know, wearing white hats and be all good, and the baddies to be all bad. Much more interesting if they're a bit more nuanced. And so Martin and Mandy in the first three books, they're the people we identify with, but it doesn't mean that they're perfect or that they don't get things wrong or they're not flawed or they're not haunted by what's happened in their past. Part of the reason I swapped out of Martin and Mandy was because I'd kind of run out of their emotional story. I didn't know where else to take it. So this story, I thought I could use Ivan and tap into some of the unresolved issues that are there in Trust. Now, you don't need to have read Trust to have read this book. As Angela was saying, it's a standalone book. But that was just the kind of spark. And this story lent itself more, I thought, to police investigators and journalists, because if I just had another journalist, it would have been, why wouldn't I use Martin? You know, I've already got a journalist character. Why wouldn't I use him? So look, just let me give the setup of the book. So this isn't a spoiler. This is the first few pages of the book. It's like a prologue. We're out in this very remote opal mining town called Finnegan's Gap. It's not a real town. It's made up like the towns in my other books, but it's not that far from Lightning Ridge, if anyone knows Lightning Ridge. It's like a smaller, wilder version of Lightning Ridge. And we're with a team of ratters. Now, ratters are the lowest of the low. They're opal thieves. They go down their friends' mines in the middle of the night and steal their opals. So we're with this rather desperate group of men who are going down to plunder their mate's opal mine. And then instead of opals, they find him. He's been murdered. And not only has he been murdered, he's been crucified. And so they get out of there as fast as they can. They don't want to be connected to this in any way, shape or form. But at least they've got, even though these guys are kind of like baddies, they've got enough conscience to ring up the police and leave an anonymous tip. And then the story proper starts with the arrival of Ivan to investigate this murder. He's been expecting to travel up there with Maurice Montefiore, but he's held over in Sydney for reasons that become apparent in the book. And so Ivan is assigned this fresh young detective that he's never met, never heard of, called Nell Buchanan. They start investigating the murder, and the more they investigate, the more secrets and the more crimes and whatever they start to uncover.
Yeah, that's a very good summary of what's happened. So does that mean that there's going to be no more books with Martin and Mandalay and little Liam? Because I really liked them characters.
Well, I suspect there will be. I just need to have the right sort of ideas and right stories grow. So yeah, I think at some stage we will return to them. Yeah.
Excellent. Now you did just allude to this, but there was a lot going on in this book. The like the seer and all his followers, the big business, the politics, the murder. But the thing that fascinated me was like there was even that part with Morris's business card being found in Stanley Honeywell's house. And I won't say anything more about that because obviously I don't want to give any spoilers. But how did you keep track of all of these different threads and tie them down so nicely?
Okay, that's a big question. So even when I started writing Scrublands, I had this idea that, having never written a crime fiction book before, I was a bit worried how to get the pacing right, because there's nothing more disappointing than you get halfway through a crime fiction book and you guess who did it, or you guess what happened. So the rest is an anticlimax. Conversely, the one thing that perhaps is worse than that is you get 10 pages from the end and suddenly the author reveals all this sort of new information, and maybe a new character, maybe it's the murderer is someone you haven't even been introduced to before, and that way you're left cheated. So what I thought the way to get around that was to have more than one mystery and more than one plot. And so if someone did guess, one of the plot lines, there'd still be the other ones continuing on. Now, and in here, there's a couple of different storylines, as Angela alluded to. So we've got the murder of this opal miner down his mine. We've also got a bunch of very colourful miners living out at this squatters camp called Deadman's Wells, including possibly some of the ratters. Then you've got a mad religious cult that is getting its adherents in and getting them to mine opals, much to the anger of the other miners. Then you've got these two big mining billionaires. They're not mining opals, but one's got this huge coal mine and one has got a plan to develop a rare earth mine. And they've got a rivalry that goes back decades. And so we've got Nell and Ivan investigating all these different issues. And then to kind of make things worse, both of them come under investigation for different reasons, for things that they've done in the past. The reason Nell has been assigned to this investigation is that she'd spent time as a young police officer, her first job as a uniformed constable out in this town. And she's under the impression she did really well in that job. But as she finds out, there were things she got dramatically wrong. Now, how do I manage to tie them all together? I'm not entirely sure myself. So I'm more at the end of the spectrum. Crime writers are often divided into plotters and pantsers. And plotters are the ones who plot the books out in their entirety before they write the narrative, which seems to me like a really smart and efficient and sensible way of doing it. However, unhappily, I am more of a pantser, and that stands for writing by the seat of your pants. So I can start books and I really don't know where things are going. And this has caused me in the past to throw out many tens of thousands of words. I'm getting a bit better of that. So I had a little bit of an idea when I started writing this, where I wanted Ivan and Nell to finish up. So I had a start point and a finish point, but I had no idea how to get between A and B. And then all these other storylines develop. So there's crimes that have happened now. There's crime that happened 6 or 7 years ago. There's another crime that happened decades ago. And so it's a little bit juggling. It's like keeping a lot of balls in the air and then kind of catching them all at one go at the end. So I don't have a whiteboard and I don't have post-it notes, but I've kind of got the computer equivalent of that, in that I've got sort of spreadsheets and sort of the digital version of post-it notes and that. So as I'm writing, it's kind of fluid. It's always changing. But in some ways, I think it's helpful. One, because instead of forcing the characters to do things, you're thinking, well, if I was this police officer, what would I do next? What would my next move be? So there's a certain logic there. And the second thing is, hey, if I can't guess what's going on, well, how can the reader?
That is very true. So that was going to be one of my questions, how you write, and do you have all the answers before you start? So
No.
with what you've just said, do you ever feel surprised by where the characters go?
Yeah, I do. And I get, so my writing habit is typically writing in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'll do housework, I'll go to shopping, I'll do some exercise, solitary exercise. So I'll ride a push bike, or I'll walk in the bush, or I'll go swim some laps. But often, particularly as the momentum of writing is picking up pace, the book will be constantly with me, and I'll have ideas, and it's like, oh yes, I know, I'll do that, I'll do that, I'll do that. And that sort of flows on. And every now and then I get, I wouldn't call it writer's block, but I get to a problem and go, what are they going to do now? How do they get out of that? So it's this constant sort of internal discussion about what's happening in the book.
Okay, so I have got a bit of a silly question, but how do you come up with the names of your characters? Like, you've got Trevor Topsoil, Bullwinkle, and Bullshit Bob.
Bullshit Bob English. He's one of the mining billionaires.
Yeah,
right?
I was thinking, how do you come up with those type of names?
So when I was writing Scrublands, I was writing in my spare time, and I had a proper job. And I think I just got a bit bored. And my expectation after the nonfiction books was, hopefully I'd get it published, but I wasn't expecting, much more than that. And so I started using these kind of outlandish Dickensian names. And then Scrublands came out and did rather well. And I got a bit embarrassed about these sort of extravagant names, until a woman said to me at an event, "Oh, I love your names. They're really distinctive. They really help me keep track of the plot, because you've got different plot lines going." And she said, otherwise I would get confused. And I thought, that's right, because that happens to me sometimes when I'm reading a book, particularly if you haven't picked it up for a week, or there's a character that reappears, has disappeared for 100 pages, comes back. And so I kept it going. And now, Angela, as you mentioned before, there are some continuing characters in Treasure and Dirt. So it would look really weird if I just had all the continuing characters had outlandish names, but all the new characters had kind of bland vanilla names. So I've decided to lean into it. I mean, they're not, there's one or two, there's a few more ordinary names there as well. But yeah, it was kind of an accident, but I think it's a happy accident.
Yeah, I think it's very good as well, for that reason of keeping track of where everyone is. I did have an audience question about Scrublands. They wanted to know where you got your idea for that book from.
Okay, so Scrublands, like Treasure and Dirt, it's got different storylines to it. And there are bits that I know where the ideas came from, and there are bits where I don't. So my initial idea was this journalist arriving in a country town, very remote country town, where some awful thing has happened, and he's sent to write a story on it. And as he's writing the story, he realizes the accepted version of events is not accurate. I did some stories like that as a journalist, this idea of going somewhere where something dreadful has happened and reporting how people are coping later on. So a year after the tsunami in Aceh in Indonesia, I went there, and did a story on how they're coping, but it's more related. I went to a little town in East Texas called Jasper some months after a terrible murder where some white extremists had taken an African-American man called James Byrd Jr., tied him to the back of their pickup truck and dragged him along until he died. And I went to that town and did a story on how it was coping. I didn't really report on the murder. That was the starting point, and there was no mystery to it. They'd caught the guys who did it. But that story was all about race relations. It was a segregated town, not by law, because that's not possible anymore in the United States, but by customs. It would, you know, the whites were on one side of the tracks and the blacks were on the other. There's none of that in Scrublands. That was my initial idea. And in the first 3 or 4 drafts, had a very slow start. It was just Martin arriving in this town. And then I had the idea, it's a pretty obvious one, that I would start with a description of the priest shooting 5 parishioners. Again, that's not a spoiler. That's what happens in the first pages of Scrublands. But I have no idea where that idea came from. Maybe, I mean, I've done gun violence stories in the United States or whatever, but I don't know of any story of a priest shooting his own parishioners. I mean, obviously not here in Australia, but not even in the US. So one aspect of the story in Scrublands, one of the storyline refers to special service soldiers committing war crimes in Afghanistan. Now, that wasn't public knowledge that anything like that had happened at the time I was writing the book, but because I was a journalist, I had friends who was beginning to investigate allegations. So it was a little bit in the ether. And it was almost like I didn't deliberately pick up on that, but I think it was just there, and it's something that I went, oh, well, that would work. That would explain, you know, some part of the gun violence. So it's a difficult, you know, I get asked questions by people who finish the book. Oh, where did that idea come from? And sometimes I have an answer and sometimes I don't. One thing that the locations are typically based not on real towns, but kind of like a real landscape. The characters, though, I don't really base, you know, some writers base characters on their friends and people they know, whatever. I certainly don't do that consciously, if I even do it at all.
And my lights have just gone out because this building does that. If I'm not moving about. Green. It's
a motion sensor. Yeah. Okay, just keep waving.
So leading into that, how much research do you do for your books?
Look, I do a bit with this one, Treasure and Dirt. I actually drove to Lightning Ridge. Now, originally, I was going to go to South Australia because I had this idea of a story about a murder at a mine. And I was thinking a big industrial mine, somewhere very remote, you know, up in northern South Australia, you know, maybe the Flinders Ranges, because, you know, it's a very dramatic landscape. And I was thinking of fly in, fly out workers' camp. So, you know, there was be a limited number of suspects in kind of confined space. And this was last year, I was ready to head off, and then COVID struck and all the borders closed. So I live in Canberra, and I couldn't get to South Australia or Victoria or Queensland, but New South Wales was still okay because it's practically impossible to close the borders between the ACT and New South Wales. So I was thinking of going to Broken Hill. And then I was just at the local shops, and I saw a woman with an opal pendant. I went, oh, an opal mining town. That would be excellent, because I mean, I could easily shift some big, you know, the big sort of industrial mines, but I didn't know much about opal mining at all, but I did know that they're typically small, you know, one-man bands or partnerships or something like that. And so I drove up to Lightning Ridge, and I walked into the miners' co-op to find someone hopefully, who might show me around the mine. The first thing I saw was a big sign saying "Dob in a ratter." I never heard of the term ratter. I said, "What's that?" And they explained that there were these sort of, scum of the earth who stole other people's opals. And I thought, good, I can use that. And a very nice miner called Fred took me down his mine and showed me the ropes and that. So to that extent, it's researched. But I do think you can over-research things. I think often it's better you want the sense of authenticity, but you don't want to bore readers with all the details. You don't want to get things glaringly wrong or inaccurate. But on the other hand, you want to give yourself leeway so the story can breathe and not be hemmed in by, all the little details. And I think that's the case with a police procedural. So the two protagonists here are police officers. A lot of police work is very routine. It's very drab. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of gathering evidence. There's a lot of consideration about how things are going to be presented in court. Homicide teams are often very large. They're often working 5 or 6 cases at once, none of which really lends itself to a compelling crime story. So research is important, but I think you don't want to take it too far.
Yes, I agree. Otherwise, we would all be reading non-fiction titles. I'm assuming we don't want total reality, do we, when we're reading fiction?
Well, the great thing about crime fiction too is you can tie it all up at the end.
Yeah.
You find out who did it and why they did it and all the rest. And the thing about true crime is it's a different dynamic. I'm not putting it down, but often the most compelling ones are the ones where you don't know who did it. And so it's open to your imagination and speculation. But that only works if it's real. You can't do that in fiction. On the other hand, in fiction, sometimes you can get to more profound truths than you can in fact.
Yes, that's true. When I was looking on your website, I thought, oh, you've got a new book out. And then I realized it was the same book, Opal Country, which is going to be released in UK. Why does it have a different name when it goes to a different country?
Yeah, it's the first time it's happened. The first 3 books have got the same title everywhere in the English-speaking world at any rate. This book we had here in Australia, we were sort of tossing around a lot of ideas. There wasn't an obvious name. With the earlier books, both Scrublands and Trust were titles I had right from close to the beginning. Not so with Silver. So here we've gone with Treasure and Dirt. The UK publishers felt that it said Australia more. And this is maybe something we don't realise, but to a lot of foreigners, particularly tourists who've come here, they associate Australia very closely with opals. In the airport, the duty-free shops, they're full of opals. And it's kind of thing, oh, if you go to Australia, you've got to get some opals, some souvenirs and whatever. So I think the UK publishers, there's some statistic that, in a bookstore, people browsing will only look at a book cover for 1 or 2 seconds or something like that. So I think what they wanted was for people to look at that and go, see the red earth and the windmill and the title and go, it's a crime book and it's set in Australia. So that, I think, is what the logic is. And they're really great publishers, so they know what they're doing.
Do you have a lot of input into the design of the cover?
Look, they're incredibly respectful and show it to me, but it's both titles and particularly covers are a bit of an arcane art. So, for example, with a crime fiction book, if someone's looking at it for the 1 or 2 seconds, they need to know, it needs to tell them what sort of book it is. So it's crime fiction, or is it chick lit, or is it science fiction, or is it romance, or is it historical, just like that. But then, as it sits on the shelves with all the other crime fiction books, they want it to stand out. So they're trying to get it to fit in and stand out at the same time. And there's a limited, unless something really doesn't work. There was one cover in the UK that was wrong because it showed a very suburban view of Australia, and that was for Trust, which is all set in inner city Sydney, you know, terrace housing sort of stuff. So I said, oh, maybe that doesn't work. But typically you've got to, you know, they know what they're doing much better than I do. When it comes to the words, I'll buy in, but the cover and the titles and that, they really know what they're doing.
That's what they're getting paid for. There is another question here from the audience. What draws you to the remote landscapes that seem to always feature in your books?
Yeah, so I'm often described as an exponent of outback noir, but Treasure and Dirt is actually the first of my 4 books that is set in the true outback. Scrublands is set in an irrigation town in the Western Riverina in New South Wales. What attracted me to that landscape is I'd been there during my research for the book, The River, the non-fiction book. And although the town I stayed at in the Western Riverina, out on the Hague Plain, you know, it's really flat. Be familiar to a lot of people in South Australia as they drive across towards Sydney. Dead flat. I stayed in this irrigation town that had no water. The river was dry. And I just thought, look, what a great, later on when I was thinking I'll write a crime fiction book, I was just thought, excuse me. I thought, what a perfect setting, because irrigation town, no water equals desperation, and desperate people do desperate things. The second book, Silver, is a regional town, but you wouldn't call it remote. It's on the north coast of New South Wales. And it's being touted as the next boom town, the next Byron Bay, or the next Noosa. And so a lot of the book revolves around real estate speculation and manoeuvring around wealth. Again, the location suggested itself from my other book, The Coast. I live in Canberra, so I'm much more familiar with the south coast of New South Wales, the far south coast, but it's too remote. No one's going to say, oh, well, that's going to be the next boomtown. That's why it was set there. Trust is actually set in Sydney because it's got to do in many ways with power and the abuse of power and corruption. And so it's got to be, what better place to set a story like that than Sydney, right? Because it's kind of in some ways the corruption centre of Australia. Apologies to anyone listening from Sydney, but and that posed for me a different issue, because I couldn't just make it up, and I was a bit worried that having made up these fictional towns, how I would go with that. But then I realised all the books that are set in real cities like London or New York, they're never just factually describing the cities. They're just, the London of Sherlock Holmes is different from the London of, I don't know, of Jane Austen or something. And the New York of Truman Capote or Tom Wolfe or whomever is different from Fleischman is in Trouble or whatever. So that was kind of fun, depicting Sydney in a certain style. But then I thought, look, with Treasure and Dirt, I'll try and play to my strengths a bit. So again, I was thinking that remote, hot, dry, true outback. So it's there, thinking about where to set my next one now. But I do, much as I like writing Trust, I do like those sort of regional settings. I think settings are very important for books. They lend atmosphere and they lend motivation for the characters.
That is very true. So will you write any more books with Ivan and Nell in them?
Look, I think so. So this, you're quite correct, Angela, at the start when you said this is being promoted as a standalone book, because that was the intention. But the same thing has happened with it, in my mind, as happened with Scrublands. By the time I got to the end of Scrublands, the characters had grown, Martin and Mandy. And I thought, particularly Martin in that book, he was evolving, he changed. He was a different person at the end of Scrublands than he was at the start. I think there's more to this guy. There's more of a backstory. And so in Silver, he returns to his old hometown, Port Silver, whereas in Scrublands, he was an absolute stranger, didn't know anyone. And in a way, Trust is about Mandy's past. So what I found now with Treasure and Dirt, thinking that it was going to be a standalone, I was thinking, I'll do a standalone while I think what I can do next with Martin and Mandy. I'm pretty sure that was my thought process. But again, Ivan and Nell have grown on me now, and I think there's more to say for them. There's more to take them. So yes, I think it's probably going to be more the first in a series than a standalone, but it will be with the same intention, which is you could pick up any of my books and just read them as standalones. You don't, they're not a strict series in that sense. If you were going back and starting the first three, you probably would want to start at Scrublands, but it's not totally necessary.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you can definitely read them as standalone, but as someone like me who likes a character, they become almost real. So I can imagine with you, they're definitely feeling very real, because they feel real to me. Like when you finish your book, it's like, oh, where's the next one? You have a bit of withdrawal from it. So I've really enjoyed them, and I'm sure everyone will enjoy them if they read them. So you make sure you put them on hold or purchase them. I did have a comment. It's not really a question, from someone. It says, I saw your new book advertised and went onto the library site and saw that you had written 3 others. So I ordered them in and was blown away by your storytelling, intrigue and plots, the mixture of characters, and could not wait for Treasure and Dirt, which I read in 2 days. I loved it. I have promoted your books to the staff at the library, my line dancing club, 2 choirs I belong to, and many friends. Many of us have brought Treasure and Dirt, and they are doing the rounds. Thank you for 4 great books. I look forward to reading many more in years to come.
That's fantastic. And who's that from?
It just says admin. They've signed in as an admin.
Oh, okay. Somewhere. Well, thank you, admin.
I don't know who they are, unfortunately. They may leave another comment and say their name, but I thought that was a really beautifully, because it is perfect what they've written. I concur with admin about that. If you have any questions, don't forget, put them in the Q&A, because we're almost running out of, we're almost to the end of our session. Which author do you like to read when you're not writing yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. So my go-to reading before starting on crime, except for those kind of non-fiction books that I had to read for work, was probably more like contemporary fiction. So I wasn't just devoted to reading crime, but I always liked Michael Connolly's books. He's the guy with Harry Bosch.
Harry Bosch. He's one of my favorite authors.
Yeah, and he's I've met him now because he's published in Australia by the same publisher. So I've had the honour, if you like, of doing your job, Angela, and interviewing him. I like him. I really like those old hard-boiled detective books, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, people like that, because they capture the atmosphere of that time. It's America, sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, the hard-nosed detective, the Humphrey Bogart guy in the trench coat. Australian writers, I always love the work of Peter Temple, who's written some exceptional books. And if you haven't read any, he's the guy who wrote the Jack Irish books that you'd be familiar with from ABC TV. But his 2 final books, The Broken Shore and Truth, are fantastic. Nowadays, I read a lot of crime fiction. much of it is because I've been asked to interview people in the way that Angela is now. So of course you have to read the books, sometimes on a panel with them at a writers festival, sometimes a publisher or an agent will ask me to read them in the possibility of endorsing them. And the thing is, it's only 3 years since Scrublands came out, but there's a lot of new crime fiction authors in Australia now. And we've all kind of become friends. And there's a big crime fiction writers festival in Sydney at the start of December. And for many of us, it'll be the first thing that we've done for many a long time. And you become friends. So of course you want to read your friends' books.
That's awesome. I'd like to meet some of those authors as well.
They're good fun. The crime
bet.
writing crew are a good fun. Yeah.
It sounds very interesting. So I think that is the end of our questions. There's no more that's come through. So on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your talk tonight. It's been very interesting. I've learnt lots. I hope all the other people that have joined us have learnt lots too. I have put in the chat that we will be putting this on our website, because we have got all of our authors that we've done on our website, and we often get more people that view them later that can't attend now. So you can look that up and view that. I will also send a survey form out to all the attendees if you could give us some feedback, or if there's anything you want to change or have different authors and whatever, you can leave it all in the feedback. You can follow our Facebook page or from further events like this, and also look on our website, because we promote all our stuff on our Facebook and website. And obviously from the email, if you have any other questions that's not covered, just send me an email and I can pass anything on to Chris at a later time. So thank you. Thank you, Chris. It's been really good.
Look, thank you, Angela, for the great questions, and thank you for everyone who's kind of tuned in, if that's the right word.
Yeah, that's excellent. All right, take care and have a good night and a good end of the week. It's well, we're middle of the week now, but it's racing towards the end of the week. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye everyone.